should have a notification to say that it's started recording. So today's webinar is about education and housing from the Census 2021. So I have done previous census webinars, which I'll talk a little bit about at the beginning here to set the context. But first things first, just talk about what the census is for those of you who may or may not know. So the census happens every 10 years and it gives us a picture of all the people and households in England and Wales. It helps organisations make decisions on planning and funding, public services, and that covers things like transport, education, healthcare. What's great about it is that it gives us a population level understanding, and it also helps us compare to other places and the national average. I think it's important to note here that when everyone did the census back in 2021, there were still some restrictions. COVID was still a thing, so some of the data is kind of impacted a little bit by that. We found that in the previous webinar, particularly around work and travel to work, because of COVID restrictions a lot more people were working from home or were doing different working patterns. So that did have a bit of an impact on some of the data that we were finding. Hi, Pip. I've only just got started. I just wanted to double check that you're okay, that I'm recording the session. Is that okay?
Course. Absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I also wanted to give a bit of an introduction to the census map. I'm not sure everyone on this call has been on my previous webinar, so I wanted to introduce it again, but it's a really great interactive tool the ONS have created for this round of the census, and you can find out what's going on in people's lives and all the different data at a really granular level. You can zoom in and out different areas, you can pick which data you want to look at, and it's a really great tool to go and explore for your piece of work. I will be using it at one point today, so I can show you how it works as well. To give a bit of context as well, I've already done 2 webinars, one on population, one on labour market and travel to work. I was just saying before everyone joined that I have recorded both of those as well. So if you are interested in those, I can also share those recordings when I share the recording of this one today as well. So please just let me know in the chat or via email if you'd like to see those as well. And then I will be doing our last one on health, disability and unpaid care on the 16th of February. Again, if you're interested, please sign up on our website. If you can't make it again, it will be recorded and I can share the recording with you if you're interested. So I'll just quickly do a slide on each of the previous webinars about kind of setting the scene a little bit. So the first webinar we did was on population statistics, and we have just over 500,000 people that live in Somerset, around a third of which live in South Somerset. A quarter of our population is age 65 and over, which is quite a lot higher proportion than England average, and so we've got quite a ageing population here in Somerset. We do have some deprivation across the county, but it's very varied. We have quite a small proportion of households who are deprived in 3 or more dimensions, and those dimensions are education, health, housing or employment. And the highest rates tend to be in more pockets of urban centres, so places like Bridgewater and Highbridge. The last webinar that I did back in December was on labour market and travel to work. And there we looked at the type of work that people did. So around 60% of residents are economically active. So that's they're either in work or actively looking for work. Rural areas were more likely to host residents with higher socioeconomic jobs. And we found that a really high proportion of Somerset residents drive to work, which was a lot higher than other areas of England. A lot of that was related to the rural nature of our county, the lack of public transport in some areas. And it was really interesting to think about how that fits in with our active travel kind of strand of work and what we're interested in there. But today we're going to be talking about education and housing. So the data that we're going to be looking at are the highest level of qualification for education and the proportion of people that are in full-time education at the moment. Housing, we'll be looking at accommodation type, tenure and occupancy rating. We'll also be looking at, they ask a couple of questions around central heating and availability of cars and vans, which I will touch upon because I think they are kind of relevant to our work. And then once I've talked through all the data that's been found, I will also do a section on why it's important for our work and how we can try and fit it into the work that we're doing here at SAS, but also across Somerset and across our Somerset Moves strategy. So I'm going to start with education. So around 16 to 17% of Somerset residents are in full-time education. So full-time education, the definition they use at the census is it's whether someone aged 5 or above is in full-time education. So it includes school children, but also includes adults in full-time education. And school children and students who are studying away from home, so for example, they're at university, they would usually resident at their term time address. So therefore, if they're at university, it would be their uni address that they would be using in this case. What we found is around 90,000 residents are in full-time education. The lowest rate was 16.1% in South Somerset. The highest rate was in Mendip. What we found that's a little bit lower than the England average, but I don't think that's that surprising given we don't have any major cities or we don't have any university towns or cities either. And so what you might find is that it's significantly lower than the more traditional university cities. So for example, Oxford, Cambridge, Nottingham, Manchester, big cities like that that host a lot of university students and might have multiple universities were more around a third of people were in full-time education in those areas, which is kind of double the amount that we're seeing in some of the areas that we have in Somerset. What we do find though is that boarding schools do tend to skew figures when you're looking at a really granular level. So here I've got Millfields in Street, and as you can see, 85.4% in that area are full-time students. So Millfields covers the majority of that really granular level. And so we're seeing a really high proportion of people who live there who are full-time students. See similar, albeit a bit lower percentages for places like Bruton and some areas of Taunton as well. So just to put it in context that if you look at Street as a whole, it might have a higher proportion than other areas in Somerset, but then if you look at more granular level, there is a kind of quite specific reason why that is the case. We find that 3 in 10 residents of Somerset have level 4 qualifications or above. So this question asks what's the highest level of qualification you have? And it includes foreign qualifications where they can be matched to a UK equivalent. So level 4 or above is kind of bachelor's degree or a higher national certificate or higher national diploma or above. So it could be postgrad, it could be PhD. The second most common category for Somerset was level 3 qualifications, which is 2 or more A levels or equivalent. And we found that to be dissimilar to England, actually, which was no qualification as the second most common type of top qualification. What we found was that our percentage that have a level 4 or above is slightly lower than the England average. Mendip is about the same as the England average, and we're seeing quite a significant difference between Mendip and Sedgemoor, where Sedgemoor is closer to 25% of people who had level 4 or above. And what we've tended to see is that lower rates tend to be in some areas of urban areas. So pockets of urban areas see lower rates that achieve that level 4 or above. So places, some parts of Chard, Bridgewater, Taunton and Yeovil. And this is quite an interesting point. It kind of links into some of the previous things we talked about in the previous webinars, that it tends to be rural areas that have also got more people with higher qualifications, and that really ties into some of the other things we're finding about rural areas. So for example, that had less deprivation in some of those rural areas, people had higher socioeconomic jobs in those areas. So it's kind of showing a bit of the disparity between rural and urban areas in Somerset. I think it's important to note that it's only parts of those urban areas that we're seeing that. So it's not the whole of urban areas. So it's not, for example, the whole of Taunton. It's kind of pockets of Taunton, which you can really see on the census map. You can kind of get into a bit more detail on.
Annabelle, that's I was going to ask a question if that's all right, but I think you've nearly answered it.
Yeah.
If you drill down on those maps, can you drill down? Because I do work in a deprived area of Taunton, and I would want to be able to extract information. And will that interactive map allow me to do that?
Yes, it will.
Great.
Yeah. And I can show you that, and there's something else I'm going to show everyone towards the end of the session, is that they've now created something where you can define the area that you're working in, and it doesn't have to be defined by parish or output area or county. You can define it yourself and download all the data related to that. So I'll show you that as well,
That's
which
amazing.
might be really good for you.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Thanks.
So what we're finding for apprenticeships is that 6.5% have stated that apprenticeship was their highest qualification, and the highest amount we're seeing is in South Somerset. This is higher than the England average of 5.3%. And I guess what we're seeing here is the flip side to those areas that have got the highest amount of level 4 qualifications. So those that have got fewer proportion of people with level 4 had the higher proportion of apprenticeships. So we're seeing a flip side on that. So it's not kind of necessarily the case that people in those areas that have got fewer level 4 qualifications have got no qualifications. They've just gone down a different route and have kind of gone down the apprenticeship route. It would also be really interesting to explore kind of what areas of work these apprenticeships are in. Is there particular industry that areas of Somerset are using apprenticeships, or are there particular clusters of apprenticeships in different areas? And that's something you can explore a bit more on the census map as well. But I think what's interesting to also think about is that the question asks around the highest level of qualifications, but we are still seeing quite a big proportion of residents in Somerset that don't have any qualifications. So we've got 17.1% who have no qualifications, which is quite similar to the England average. In Sedgemoor, that's up to 1 in 5 people, so up to around 20% of people. But again, it kind of varies. It depends on the different areas, and as you can see from this image of the map, the darker the blue, the higher proportion of people who have no qualifications. So as you can see, there's areas of Bridgewater which are very dark blue, and so there's in that particular area there's almost 30% of people who live there that don't have any qualifications. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of show you how you can use the census map to explore that point a little bit more closely. So I'm just going to stop sharing and I'm going to share my census map. So this is the census map for anyone who hasn't yet looked at it. So if I zoom all the way out, you can do it for the whole of England, and you can move around and you can pick the area that you want to focus on. Over on the left here, you can pick the different types of statistics that you want to look at, and then you can zoom right in. So for some of the statistics, you can zoom into a very small area. Some don't have that ability to go so granular, but in most cases you can go very, very granular, which is really great. So if we look at Bridgewater and that point around kind of no qualifications, you can see now we're getting to a lot of detail in terms of a couple of streets, and there are some areas that have got over 40% of people who don't have any qualifications, and that's quite different from kind of the areas of Bridgewater over here, for example, that are only 15% of people that don't have any qualifications. So I think what's interesting to note here is then you can think about, okay, let's have a look at these areas. They've got people with no qualifications. You can then go back over here on the left and have a look at what else is going on in those areas. So for example, we might want to look at population and then look at household deprivation. So as I said before, there's whether a household is deprived in one or more ways, and they have a definition of there being 4 different ways. So it could be education, employment, health, and housing. So obviously education, qualification, that's one part of deprivation, but there are three other parts as well. So you'd expect there to be some kind of link with people with no qualifications to be in more deprived area, but not that be the only link. But as you can see here, when you're looking at a household that's deprived in 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions, these areas are still kind of the darker areas. That is something that's going on for those people that have no qualifications. You can also then look at work, for example. So if we go back over here and we think about work, you can see, for example, economically active. So are these people economically active? We're seeing here again that around 50–60% of people who live here are not economically active. So that means they are not in work and not actively looking for work. Again, that might be something else that's going on for these people. And then you can also look at things like, for example, their job and what type of job they have, or the socioeconomic status of their job. So you can look at if someone's in a higher managerial job, a lower managerial job, they're a small employer, they're more technical or routine occupations. And as if you look here, we've got quite a small proportion of people who are in the higher ones. They tend to live kind of further out. But then as you go more towards routine, semi-routine, you're seeing a trend across the whole of Bridgewater, or the most of Bridgewater here, that this is kind of an area of work that a lot of people work in and live in. You can also see, which I think is quite important at this point, is that if we're looking at those that have never worked or long-term unemployed, there's a very high proportion of people who live in this particular area that have see that. So I think it's just a way of showing what you can explore in your different areas, and particularly if you're working in a place-based way or in a particular part of a town or city or a rural area, you can really get down to the granular detail about what's going on in those areas. So now I'm going to just flip back to the slides again. And I'm going to move on to housing. So what we have got for housing are a few different things. So the first thing to look at is accommodation type. So we have got about 86.5% of people who live in a house or a bungalow, and that's quite a lot higher than the England average, which is about 10% lower than that. So 10 percentage points, sorry, lower than that, which is around 77%. We've only got 12.7% of people who live in a flat or an apartment, which again is around 10% lower than England or Wales. So those 10% of people that are not living in a flat or apartment are living in a house or a bungalow for us. And we've got less than 1% of people who are living in a caravan or other mobile or temporary structure, which is very similar to the England average. I think this is not too surprising for us that we have got more people living in houses and bungalows than flats and apartments, given, as something I've said before, we're more of a rural county, we don't have a city, and predominantly in cities we tend to see a higher proportion of people who live in flats and apartments. So I don't think this is a particular surprising statistics, but it's something to think about when we're thinking about, for example, physical activity and where we might want to do those things. We are finding that the highest rate of people living in flats and apartments is in Somerset West and Taunton, which is around 15.6%. And some of those areas, there's a really high proportion of people who live in flats or apartments. So, for example, in Minehead here, there's pockets of Minehead where it's basically just made up of flats and apartments, and it's a similar case in Taunton. So really central urban centres, you see a very high proportion of people who lives in flats and apartments. And again, it kind of relates to built environment and active environments, thinking about what their access is to outside space, what their access is to kind of places to be physically active if they live in flats and apartments versus if you live in a house with a garden, for example.
Annabelle, do you know, was there an option when people completed the census if they were homeless?
So I don't actually know that. I can have a look though. That's a very good question though, Angela. It's a very good question because it gets sent out to people's homes.
Yeah.
So I don't actually know if it would get it, because this statistic, the one around temporary homes and mobile homes, it might have got sent to, say, for example, temporary accommodation. So in a sense, it might capture some of those, but that's a really interesting question. And I might have a look actually at how they went about doing that and capturing that information. I'll note that down and have a
Yeah,
look.
thanks. I mean, you're obviously just so knowledgeable about it. So please, I hope you didn't mind me asking, because
No,
I'm learning loads from you. So thank you. But it is interesting. I see Pip's got his hand up, so maybe he knows the answer.
Oh,
Well,
hi Pip. Sorry, I couldn't see you.
I'm showing my age, but I haven't really been involved in this census, but I was involved in previous ones. And although most of it is postal, there's been a lot of effort to send out enumerators to pick up people who are not picked up by the normal means, whatever, for whatever reason they're in transit or hotels or whatever it is. And it's not perfect, and I think they would accept that it's not perfect, but they certainly do try.
Thanks.
Or used to try, and I'm sure they still do.
Thanks.
Ginny's got a hand up too.
Hi, yeah, the engagement officers went out to shelters and to encourage them. Not that that necessarily means that everybody's filled it in, but that's the route that it gets done.
Thank you. I guess I wondered what they would classify in that housing. If you weren't in a house, you weren't in a flat, you weren't in a caravan, but then maybe the caravan encompasses homeless or transient, because clearly I know we would know, but it would be misleading to think there are no homeless people in Somerset, but I know we know that. So thank you, everyone. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's all right. I welcome any questions. So thank you, Angela. And thanks for the input, Pip and Ginny. So now moving on to tenure. So that's around whether a household rents or owns the accommodation that they live in. Households that rent their accommodation will also ask what type of landlord owns or manages it. So it's if it's a private landlord or social housing. So there's a high proportion of people in Somerset who own their homes compared to England, and 40.3% of that 68.5% own it outright. So that means that they don't have a mortgage. And that's, again, higher than the England average. It increases to 50% for rural areas of Somerset. So that means that quite a lot of people who live in rural Somerset own their homes outright, and they don't have a mortgage on them. I don't think this is necessarily too surprising, given some of the findings from the previous webinars about population, and that we have a lot of people who come to Somerset to retire. We have quite a high proportion of people who are 65 plus, and they are more likely to own their homes outright than people who are younger. So I think it's just interesting to think about and how to access those types of people who might not have the same kind of social networks of those who live in kind of social housing or renting. Less than a third of people rent compared to England, which is 31.4% compared to England average of 37.3%. What was kind of seen across the whole of England, though, is that more people are more likely to rent in cities, and so again that kind of rural, fewer city nature of Somerset kind of plays a part here as well in terms of rent. Across the whole of England, the southwest as a whole area, so not just Somerset, had the second highest rate of home ownership after the southeast. So that's really putting into context where we sit in there. So in terms of bedrooms and occupancy, so one of the things that the census does is look at the number of rooms, but also the number of bedrooms that people have, but also the occupancy of those rooms, and they kind of create an occupancy rating, which provides a measure of whether a household's accommodation is overcrowded or underoccupied. So it's a bit complicated how they work it out, because it depends on the age of children and how many adults and children there are. But on the ONS website, they do have a description of how they work it out, and the age of children, the sex of children, how it all fits together. But what we're finding is that 65.5% of homes in Somerset had 3 or more bedrooms, which is a bit higher than the England average. And almost 3/4 of homes in Somerset had more bedrooms than required. So when we say that they're more bedrooms than required, we're saying that that occupancy rating is showing that they're kind of under occupied based on the amount of people that you could fit into that house, for example. On the flip side, we had 1.9% that had fewer bedrooms than required, so what you would define as overcrowded. Whilst that is quite a small proportion and a lot smaller than England, I think it's important to note that group of people that live in those overcrowded housing is really important and really like a group of people that we would want to think about and focus on. We find that there are higher rates in some urban areas where, as I showed you before, there are more flats, fewer homes with 3 or more bedrooms. Whilst it's still quite a low percentage, overall it hides some things in certain areas. So for some areas of Bridgewater, Frome, Yeovil, we're seeing greater than 10% of homes that have an occupancy rating that shows that the housing is overcrowded. So these are areas that we might want to focus on, particularly because there's a lot of research out there about how overcrowding can be an issue for health and for physical activity, and how it can cause kind of physical and mental health issues for both children and adults. I'm quickly going to just go through central heating in cars and van availability, because that was also under the housing side of things. Like England, Somerset has the majority of people on mains gas only, but what's a bit different about Somerset is that we have quite a lot of people who are on heating oil, which is why our second highest central heating was other central heating, which covers heating oil in there. And again, it's kind of the rural nature of our county as to why we've got heating oil. We don't have as many housing on just electric for their central heating. We've also got a very small proportion of people who are using renewables. And when I say renewables, it's only renewables, not renewable mixed with something else. But that is also it's not uncommon across England. We're seeing that across the majority of England. So it's just putting into context central heating. Again, central heating, it kind of really fits in with kind of health, physical health, and your ability to then do physical activity. And then car and van availability. So I wanted to just highlight this because in the previous slide I talked about the previous webinar, sorry, I talked about travel to work. And we had a very high proportion of people who drove to work or were given a lift to work. And what we see is 86% of people have at least one car or van. So there's quite a lot of people that also have more than one in their household. And there are high proportions of car and van ownership in the southeast and southwest, so we're seeing that trend again where the southwest and southeast, have more housing than flats, bigger houses, less occupancy issues, and more kind of car and van availability. That's a higher proportion than we're seeing across England, which just saw 77%. Again, kind of linked to the city thing where fewer people in cities have a car or van. But it kind of ties into that active travel point where we saw about 58% of people use a car or van to get to work, which was very high relative to the England-wide. So it's just thinking about the kind of context of that. As you can see in the map, the kind of lower rates in the urban areas, which again, as I said, it's kind of linked to if you live in urban areas, it's slightly less likely to need a car, so the rates are slightly lower, but they're still relatively high. But what we are finding is that in some rural areas, everybody has a car, so almost 100% for some of the areas. We also saw in the top left of that map, you can see kind of Watchet and Minehead have got slightly lower rates of people with a car or a van, and I think that also tied into the travel to work thing where they had relatively high rates of bus travel there. And when I say relatively high, it was still very low, but it was higher than the rest of the county. And I think it was Stuart Brock got in touch after the last webinar and kind of mentioned around Hinkley Point and the fact that there's a lot of workforce buses and I'm sure some of you saw about the news, the sad news about the workforce bus this week, and because of the ice, but that might also be driving that people don't necessarily need a car or a van because they're kind of getting their bus to work. But I think it's something to think about in general about car and van availability and linking it to our active travel element. I think the other thing that interested me about this question is that we ask this of households, their car and van availability, but we don't ask anything, for example, like their availability of having a bicycle or other kind of transport methods that you might own, so like a scooter or something, which might be interesting for them to think about next time. Given kind of the active travel piece, it might be interesting to see how many people have access to and availability of a bike. I just wanted to quickly touch on some of the future plans that the ONS have got around households. So they've got some publications and analysis that they're thinking of doing. So for example, household characteristics, so size of the house and location and the number of people inside by tenure, whether it's owned or not. Also, household characteristics of the people that live there. So for example, age, gender, other demographics, also by whether they own it or not. Any trends in the fuel type, which I think is quite topical at the moment, and then looking more deeply at the overcrowding and under occupancy data by tenure and also household characteristics. So there's just some things that they're planning on publishing within the next year or so. They're looking at them in a bit more detail, so it might be worth just keeping an eye out for those. So I just wanted to touch on something that they've literally just published this week, and it's custom area profiles. So it's what I was talking a little bit about earlier to you, Angela. So it's data by different area types. For example, could be your neighbourhood, your ward, or your parish. So you can find that area by name or by postcode. You can just type it in. Or what's also really great is you can draw your own map area on the map. So for example, if the area that you're working in doesn't fit neatly into like a ward or a parish or a county or, you know, an output area, you can actually draw it on the map, and then what you can then do is select the data that you're interested in on the left hand side, and it creates this profile that shows, I've shown here on the right hand side, it shows you a map, it can show you the key statistics that you're interested in. You can save this, you can export it, you can save it as an image, you can save all the data behind it. What's really great as well is you can add it to your website. So there's a code where you can get an embedded code that you can add to your website. So again, other people can explore it. And I just think it's a really great way of, if you've got a particular area that you're really focused on and you want to like compare different parts and different data in that area, then it's a really great way of doing that, and really simply, and not having to just focus on predefined areas, I suppose. So that's, I just want to show that to you, and it's kind of got I've got a link for everyone that I can share afterwards. And then I just wanted to quickly touch on how the census relates to our work. So the census really helps us to understand the context that we're working in. For example, we may think we know who needs our help the most, but the census data adds context and data behind those thoughts. It shows us population demographics, where these people are, what's going on for their lives. Also adds context to the findings we get from the active lives survey. So we might want to compare inactivity levels across the different local authorities, but there may be some population level differences that are driving those. We can also use census information to help plan the services we provide to those who need them most. So we can find it, use it to find those more at risk of lower levels of physical activity and give them the support they need. And I'll quickly kind of show you how we might think about linking the census data. So for example, to the active lives survey, which is something we're using. So 3 of the findings that we had from the latest active lives survey was Sedgemoor was the least active area. Over a third of adults in the lowest socioeconomic group are inactive, and the young people are no longer the most active group. They always used to be, and they're no longer. And how we can link that to the population data from the first webinar is that we can start to think about what is it about Sedgemoor that may be driving this, what population statistics, where are those in the lower socioeconomic group live, what might be going on for those people and what in those places. Where are those young people and what's going on for those? You can also think about the employment and travel data adding context. So why are residents in Sedgemoor more likely to drive to work? What's driving that? Is it job? Is it access to the M5? Are those in the lower socio group more likely to be long-term unemployed? If not, what do they do for work? How might that impact their ability to be active? Where do young people work? How do they get there? And then from this webinar, it's thinking about what's the link between education and physical activity, how might that drive physical activity in certain areas, what might tenure and type of housing for those in a lower socioeconomic group look like, how might education level relate to that group, and for young people thinking about particularly ownership of housing, how might that impact how active they are, if they're more likely to live in overcrowded housing, how that might impact it to them as well. And then finally, I just wanted to kind of pull it all together and link it to Somerset Moves, which is our system-wide strategy, which we're currently going through the pillars at the moment and having really interesting conversations with lots of people across Somerset. We've done the children and young people and increasing community activity, and we've got 2 more next week. But things like education and housing are really key to some of these things. They really fit in with things like developing more active environment. So, for example, this morning in my breakout room, when we were talking about increasing community activity, I had someone who's from a housing provider who works in community investment, and it's thinking about how does the environment that they create and the housing development that they've created, how does that help people become more active? How can you increase the community activity? Also, how does housing fit in with kind of new housing developments, how you design and plan them for people to be more active, and really thinking about education. So at that, children, young people level, how do you kind of embed education with physical activity? And then just kind of stepping back a bit, thinking about that it's a system-wide strategy, and often when we're looking at physical activity, we kind of focus mainly on people who work in physical activity, but actually things like education and housing are still really important, and that we are doing a system-wide strategy, and all these things are really important to people, and the pathways and barriers that we have an impact on from the people that we're working with. So whilst it might be more difficult to think about how education and housing fits into physical activity, if we get some of those things right, physical activity can become easier and more of a thing for people to be able to take part in. And finally, what's next? I've got the Health, Disability and Unpaid Care Census webinar, and that's in February. So please do join if you're interested, or share the link with anyone that you think might be interested. I'm going to end there, and I've got 5 minutes left. So if anyone has any thoughts or questions or anything they'd like to know a bit more about, then we've got kind of 5 minutes to discuss. Stop sharing my screen.
Firstly, can I just say, like, this has been an amazing, thank you very much. It's like so helpful to me. So helpful. Out of interest, which age group is the most active, if not 16 to 34-year-olds?
So it's the middle age group, so it's 35 to 55, I think.
Right, interesting.
Yeah. So it has always been 16 to 34s for a very long time, and then in the last Active Live survey, they dropped off slightly, and that kind of like middle, I don't want to call them middle age, but you know what I mean, the middle group became the more active.
Oh, really interesting. And actually, without hijacking the whole meeting, we've got a really big 10-year housing project in Briarswood, which is a very deprived ward, and there'll be lots of navy blues on ours when I look it up. And you know what? I feel like I don't know if the project team have ever considered and considered what you're saying about being more active, but I am on the project board of that, so I will look for any opportunities to perhaps invite somebody from SASP, because there's different working groups. And we're only at the first phase, and I do think if there are any opportunities, particularly looking at the open spaces that are going to be there, to consider just what you're saying. So thank you. Like, it's just been so interesting and so useful. And how nice of you to offer it to people outside SASP.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Thanks for joining, and thanks for all your contributions and questions. It's been really helpful. Does anyone else have any thoughts or questions that they'd like to ask?
Can I just put in a comment
Yep.
kind of relating to the fact that I've dealt with 2 previous censuses, and it's amazing how slowly a lot of this changes. When you look at the areas that seem to be worst housing, lowest qualifications, what have you, I don't think there's much difference. And it is remarkable that we've been working to reduce inequalities for a very long time now. There's 2 explanations. One is that, well, at least 2. One is that they're just so entrenched that it's really hard to do it. The other is, of course, that it really is linked to housing, and if you have the cheapest housing, anybody who is in the most difficulty financially will tend to find themselves in the housing because it's the only place they can afford to live. So a bit of it is slightly depressing. Another bit is perhaps inevitable, given that houses don't move, but people do. So perhaps that's a consolation.
Yeah, because that would be my I suppose my thought process, and Annabelle has always been challenging me to go, actually you need to back that up with some data and insight. But my thought process is that I know a number of people who would have been in deprived housing, and as they got better jobs, they would move out of that, and then people would come back in. So you're right, Pip, I think it is about the housing stock.
But particularly where you've got, I can speak obviously with some authority around large portions of social housing, in Priorswood and Howcan and some of those places you're talking in Bridgewater. So, that is a good point. I know I've missed, and I'm going to go on obviously now. I feel I can use and look at the population, but I'm particularly interested to see if there's been changes there, particularly perhaps where English is an additional language, for example, because anecdotally, I'm hearing some really interesting things from primary schools around so for example, in Priorswood, one of our primary schools is reporting that over 50% of their reception class have got children with English as an additional language. Now, I'm going to guess that is really different to 10 years ago. And there's a real community development need to understand that and to meet those needs. So I would expect some areas to change, but as you said, sadly, not many. And then when I felt almost I was reluctant to use the data until this new stuff's available because it felt so out of date. But then it's depressing to hear what you're saying, Pip, which is it's probably not that different anyway.
Well, it is complicated because it's a census. I know it's a census of people, but the way it's presented, until we get the raw stuff out in 100 years' time, it's not really about the people, and that level of joining up is something that we do struggle with. And we're dealing with people, so it's brilliant. It's the biggest data source we have by miles, but we always have to remember what it tells us and what it doesn't tell us.
Yeah, agreed. I think what's good this year, Pip, is that they've made it more accessible for more people to use it. So this census map, this drawing of things, I think the way that they're presenting it makes us all look at it differently and be able to use it in different ways. Whereas before it just used to kind of be this huge data set and reports and things that come out of it. So hopefully it's made it more accessible for people to use and think about the areas that they're working in.
Yeah, it's excellent. It's excellent. It really is. And thank you for publicising it the way you do. It's really good.
Yeah, brilliant.
That's all right.
I suppose my comment, which I've put in the chat, is that the thing that I think, given we've talked about the housing stock, that hasn't changed that I see at all is the educational attainment. So it doesn't seem to matter how much we put into education, and we know that a good qualification actually creates social mobility for those people, that actually we're continually seeing that those people in the lowest housing or the most deprived areas have got the lowest educational attainment, and that feels like a seriously depressing statistic that we should be able to change. That is something that isn't about housing stock, that is something about aspiration. You know, we don't really know, but it's something about aspiration and education and, you know, all of those things. And I hugely depressed but also quite energized about how we try and change that. And Angela, your work in the very small areas, like of you know, in those lower, you know, sub, whatever you call them, super output areas, are really, really key to helping us do that. And we can only do that collaboratively, because that is a whole system thing, not one thing will do it. That is such a system change that we could try.
Yeah, I mean, and even depressingly, you know, if you think about Halcombe, that's probably been more than 10 years of one team input since Andy Murphy's days, and that hasn't really brought about much too. But but we all you know, massively, you know, there are so many opportunities, and even within that, there are some amazing successes, aren't there? But it's hard; they're hard to find, and you know, I think. It
feels like we could pull a team around a small place, and see what we could do. What would we learn if we did that?
Yeah, and I mean, clearly, being able to extract what we need from there really will help with bid writing and trying to convince strategically the powers that be about investment and those opportunities. So, so thanks again for today.
Yeah.
You're really good at it. You're really good.
Thanks, Annabelle.
Thanks, everyone. So as I said, I'll share. One. Yeah, I'll share. Thanks, Angela. It'd be great to see you again. I'll share the recording and the slides afterwards, and please feel free to share them as widely as possible with people that you're working with. And Angela, I'll also share the previous ones with you as well.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.